The year is 1917. The Russian Empire is crumbling, and the tide of revolution is sweeping across Eastern Europe. In the Ukraine, the borderland between what was once the Tsar's vast domain and the Central European kingdoms, a new political landscape is emerging. Amidst the chaos of the Russian Revolution, Nestor Makhno, son of a poor peasant family, finds himself in the thick of the ideological brawl for the future of the East. The Ukraine immediately became a battleground of political factions as chaos erupted in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Bolsheviks, Ukrainian nationalists, Cossacks, Tsarists, Republicans, and ideologues of every kind began to fight tooth and nail for control over Ukraine's rich agricultural resources and vast territory. Nestor Makhno, who was just released from prison thanks to a general amnesty declaration in the wake of the February Revolution, returned to his homeland in southern Ukraine. In the town of Huliapoli, Makhno joined the Social Democratic Labor Party, but soon found himself disillusioned with moderate socialism. He organized local peasants and workers into the Union of Poor Peasants, and began planting the seeds of revolution against the White Army, whose grip was, at the time, strengthening around southern Ukraine and Crimea. The Union of Poor Peasants eventually transformed into the Black Army, a revolutionary anarchist militia which now targeted the Tsarist forces and wealthy landowners in Ukraine, and fought a guerrilla campaign against the invading Central Powers. In 1918, following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, German and Austro-Hungarian forces occupied Ukraine, crushing the anarchist territories. But after the Battle of Dobrivka, the tides turned on the Germans and Austrians, and the Makhnovists came to control much of the Dnieper River in the south. Makhnov set about constructing anarcho-communist institutions, replacing the Tsarist system with one of his anarchist communes and the redistribution of land. After the First World War came to an end, the borders in the Ukraine still continued to change. The Bolsheviks, having successfully consolidated enough power to form a stable government for the Soviet Union, launched an invasion of the Ukrainian People's Republic, an independent nationalist Ukrainian state which was formed around Kiev as a result of the February Revolution. The Ukrainian People's Republic didn't have the political control to muster a force strong enough to counter the Bolsheviks, and thus united with the West Ukrainian People's Republic, which controlled western Ukraine and parts of Galicia. This newly unified Ukrainian state, however, now faced enemies on all sides, having decided to wage war with the Poles over Galician land, and still facing attacks from White Russian and Bolshevik forces, including from many Cossacks who mostly aligned themselves with the White Army. The Makhnovists, as the Black Army called themselves, initially joined the side of the Bolsheviks, seeing them as fellow leftist revolutionaries. But the Bolsheviks' continued attempts to strip Makhnov of power and integrate the Black Army directly into the Red Army led to a quick falling out between the two groups. The Bolsheviks, in response to Makhnov's resistance to absorption into the Red Army, began to arrest the anarchists and seize their supply shipments in an incredible betrayal. The Makhnovists were now forced to fight the Bolsheviks and the Whites, and after a short-lived and generally unfruitful alliance with Crimean White Army forces under White Army General Pyotr Wrangel, they began to be worn down by the formidable Red Army. By 1921, the Reds consumed Ukraine in its entirety, and Makhno and a small band of followers marking the end of the Makhnovshchina. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formally established in 1922, and the dream of an independent Ukraine was extinguished as the country was absorbed into the Soviet Union. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the anarchist movement was never snuffed out, and Makhnovshchina became a reality? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios, or just have ideas you'd like to be made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. So, when the Ukrainian People's Republic and West Ukrainian People's Republic had declared their unification in January, hoping to forge a united Ukrainian state, there was a disconnect between the governments of Kyiv and Lviv. In the ensuing treaties with Poland, the Ukrainian People's Republic ceded massive swaths of Galician territory, which was formerly claimed by West Ukraine, over to Poland, without consulting the West Ukrainians. In response, West Ukrainian dictator Yevhen Petrushevich convened a meeting in Vienna without consulting the government in Kiev, at which a decision was made to unilaterally repeal the Act of Unification. But even these actions came too late, and the Bolsheviks invaded and destroyed all of the various Ukrainian factions, from the Nationalists to the Anarchists. But perhaps we can change things. Let's suppose, somehow, the Act of Union between the UPR and West UPR, instead of faltering, was reinforced by an unexpected coalition: Nestor Makhno's anarchist forces and the Don Cossacks. This Act of Union may be our best opportunity for Makhnovshchina to sustain itself in some form. Perhaps the Ukrainian nationalists, both East and West, see that integrating other factions into their already quite decentralized and regionalist coalition may grant them the capacity to defend against threats from Poland, the White Army, and the Bolsheviks. Furthermore, we might assume, for the sake of the scenario, that the Cossacks, who generally simply sought a state of their own or further independence within a larger state, like the Russian Empire, see this Ukrainian union as the best candidate to allow them to exist undisturbed. So together, in this hypothetical, the pragmatic anarchists, autonomy-driven Cossacks, and nationalist Ukrainians would forge the Union of Communes and Hetmanates of Ukraine, a unified but highly decentralized front ready to carve its name into the history books. In its early years, this Ukrainian Union would find itself in an organizational period. During this time, the nationalists who controlled the former Ukrainian People's Republic in West Ukraine would come to form the plurality of those running the central government and dealing with foreign affairs, while the Makhnovists and Cossacks would come to generally be content with self-government within the Union. But this hardly meant that they wouldn't play a role in defining the actions of the Ukrainian Union early on. In fact, far from it. You see, Nestor Makhno, by this point, had already fought alongside the Bolsheviks in the early days of the Russian Civil War, and furthermore had met Vladimir Lenin in person in 1918, only a year earlier. In our own timeline, the Bolsheviks sought to conquer Poland, Belarusia, and Ukraine, seeing all three as crucial territories for the spread of the revolution. But let's say something wildly different happens. Makhno would travel to Moscow to meet with Lenin in order to propose a bold plan, a joint invasion of Poland, with a promise that Ukrainian forces would help secure Soviet control over Belarusia and parts of eastern Poland, while Ukraine would be allowed to maintain its independence and its western holdings in Galicia. Now, Lenin, obviously wary of the strength of this brand new Ukrainian coalition, particularly these anarchists and Cossacks, and seeing an opportunity to weaken Poland, would, for the sake of the scenario, agree to the plan, at least temporarily. Let's say he calculated that the Soviets could deal with the Ukrainians later, after the immediate threats were neutralized. Obviously, this requires us to make some assumptions about how far both Makhno and Lenin are willing to go in terms of pragmatic alliances, but stranger alliances certainly have been forged in history, especially during the Russian Revolutionary period. So if we continue down this route, a joint Soviet-Ukrainian invasion of Poland would begin in the spring of 1919. The Second Polish Republic would be quite unprepared for an invasion from the east and south, and so Ukrainian forces, bolstered by some of Makhno's cavalry and a handful of Cossack brigades, would push deep into Galicia, finally solidifying their control over the outskirts of Lviv and fighting towards Rzeszów. Meanwhile, Soviet forces would cut off Polish reinforcements and push toward Białystok, intending to halt just before Warsaw. By the end of 1919, the Union of Communes and Hetmanates of Ukraine would have secured its eastern borders and repelled its most immediate threats. However, the uneasy alliance between the Ukrainian forces and Soviet Union would already have begun to fray, even while joint offensives against Poland continued, Lenin still itching to bring the fertile region fully under Soviet control. Recognizing this, Simon Petliura, nationalist chairman of the Ukrainian People's Republic, would play his cards right with the other allied powers on the continent. His plan was simple: convince the French government to recognize Ukraine in exchange for halting Ukrainian advances at the outskirts of Lviv, thus positioning Ukraine as a buffer state against the Soviet Union and securing the West Ukrainian People's Republic's intended territorial acquisitions. The French, having invested heavily in the White Movement only to see it collapse, were desperate for a bulwark against Bolshevism. Of course, the label of bulwark against Bolshevism would only be a half-truth. would only be a half-truth when applied to this Ukrainian Union, as Ukraine was quite obviously fighting alongside the Soviets in Poland. But the French and their allies had, too, fought with the Soviets against the Central Powers, perhaps not immediately alongside each other, but in the greater picture of the Great War, where networks of alliances and pragmatic agreements were not clean-cut by any means. On top of that, the failure of the White Army left the French with few reliable allies in Eastern Europe, and as Belarusia teetered toward capitulation to the Soviets, Petliura's proposals seemed somewhat palatable. The French would request that, in return for their support, the Ukrainians cease all military operations in Poland and draw their western borders at Galicia, rather than within Poland proper. After some deliberation, the terms would be agreed to, and in spite of some French misgivings about certain elements of this odd Ukrainian state, mostly Makhnov's anarchists, the French would formally recognize the Union of Communes and Hetmanates of Ukraine, and soon other European states would follow suit. The Treaty of Riga in 1921 would mark a turning point. Belarusia would be ceded to the Soviet, and Galicia would be formally recognized as part of Ukraine. This division of Poland would solidify the borders of the new Ukrainian state, and with it, a new looming conflict with the Soviets, who very clearly were eyeing their borderlands in the south. But Ukraine's deal with the West was already set in stone, and commerce with the Western powers would begin. French and American resources and supplies would be shipped to the Ukrainian states under the guise of post-war reconstruction. Such assistance from the West right on Lenin's doorstep would inevitably, though, be an outrage, and only further ignite fury within the Soviet inner circle over the existence of the Ukrainian states in the first place. Now, Lenin would begin to bitterly regret his pragmatic alliance even more. Meanwhile, Nestor Makhno, ever the thorn in Lenin's side, a Lenin, mind you, who was only 1 year away from death by then, would continue to develop his anarchist communes within southern Ukraine. With Makhnov's anarchist experiment in our decentralized Ukrainian Union being free to flourish, and with Makhnov becoming increasingly a public figurehead of the Ukrainian state alongside Chancellor Petliura and Viktor Pokrovsky, who would by then have been crowned hetman of the Don Cossacks, the communes were essentially a decentralized network of agrarian direct democracies, each operating independently, while all coming together to form a highly experimental belt of agricultural production for Ukraine. While in our own timeline, the free territories didn't really have access to or a means of purchasing modern agricultural technology, with the introduction of French and possibly American machinery and agricultural tools into the equation, the anarchists might even be able to produce more efficiently and reap larger surpluses, assuming Makhnov's experiment plays out to his failure. We should also note that Makhnov's anarchist economic model in particular bears resemblance to some aspects of syndicalism and decentralized socialist economies, where the emphasis on local control, mutual aid, and direct democracy are also visible. Syndicalism itself has actually been tested in our own history and has seen a mixture of successes and failures, from the Aragonese syndicalists in the Spanish Civil War to the Italian factory councils movement in Turin and Milan following the Great War. We've also seen some more socialist experiments that align with Makhnov's economic plans play out successfully to a certain degree, most interestingly with the experiments of British businessman Robert Owen, who became the partial owner of New Lanark cotton mills in Scotland in 1800. Robert Owen transformed New Lanark into a proto-socialist town, implementing land reforms and providing free education for his workers, and establishing cooperative stores and a welfare system of sorts. New Lanark was an incredibly successful project, but Owen also tried to implement his vision of a workers' town in the United States, where he purchased the town of New Harmony, Indiana. His experiment in Indiana bore the opposite results, however, and the town ended up being dissolved within a few years due to a mass exodus of residents fleeing poor living conditions. Suffice it to say, the sustainability of Makhnov's system would really depend on the Ukrainian people, like it had in Robert Owen's experiments. Because this anarchist system relies on voluntary cooperation in the absence of a centralized state, there are plenty of opportunities for failure, just as there were under Stalin's quota system or under peacetime collectivization. It's seriously very difficult to predict what the evolution of Makhnov's experiment would be, without reliable real-world examples of anarchism functioning over an extended period of time. Perhaps it ends up being replaced by the socialism of the Ukrainian People's Republic after Makhnov's passing, or perhaps it thrives and elements of Makhnovist economics seep into other parts of the Ukrainian Union and the wider international scene. One thing we can say for sure, though, is that in this timeline, there would be no dekulakization and, crucially, no Holodomor. The Makhnovists, by nature, opposed the idea of state control over the economy and society, which was the only means by which the Soviet authorities could carry out dekulakization in our own history. Instead, the Makhnovshchina relied nigh entirely on the support of local peasants, including those who might be labeled kulaks by Soviet standards. The Ukrainian countryside and its inhabitants would remain productive and largely self-sufficient, exporting whatever surplus grain was available to other Ukrainian states in the Union, as well as perhaps the Soviet Union and other neighboring nations, in exchange for machinery and other industrial goods. Now, should such a trade relationship with the Soviets emerge, it would certainly be uneasy, least especially due to the differences in ideology and the geopolitical nightmare that an independent Ukrainian state is for the Soviet Union in the first place. But at the same time, it could very easily provide a short-term buffer against Soviet encroachment, should the Soviets come to be reliant on Ukrainian grain. Shifting focus away from the economics of this Ukrainian Union, in Paris, leftist intellectuals would be taking a keen interest in the Ukrainian experiment. Viktor Sergey, an anarchist who fled the Soviet Union and now resided in Paris, found common cause with the Makhnovists. Other leftist intellectuals like French syndicalist Alfred Rosmer and Sébastien Faure, publisher of the anarchist magazine Le Libertat, would begin to bring leftist intellectual support to the Makhnovists and perhaps the broader Ukrainian experiment. Disillusioned with the Bolsheviks, they would regard the Ukrainian People's Republic and the anarchist communes as the last vestiges of real socialism and anarchism against a vanguardist tyranny in the Soviet Union, especially given that Stalin had taken power in 1922 with the death of Vladimir Lenin. Should a new, broader conflict with the Soviet Union arise, these émigrés would argue that Ukraine could become a rallying point for anti-Bolshevik forces and a stronghold against the Red Army, much like Afghanistan would become in the 1980s in our own history. As the 20s gave way to the 1930s, the Soviet encroachment would actually become a reality, and the fragile peace would begin to unravel. Joseph Stalin, of course now firmly in control of the Soviet Union with 8 years of rule behind him, would not be content to let Ukraine remain an independent entity. The fertile Chernozyms, Ukraine's rich and agriculturally productive black soil, were a prize Stalin coveted, essential for his plans to industrialize the Soviet Union, and something which he was not content to allow under the jurisdiction of anarchist communes or the Don Cossacks. No, Ukraine was a vital organ of the Soviet machine and needed to be reattached to its motherland. With the Great Depression now hitting the Western powers, Stalin began his step towards taking Ukraine. Soviet secret police, the predecessors to the KGB, operated within Ukrainian territory and reported back to Stalin, who was growing increasingly paranoid. His regime faced numerous threats, both from within and along the borders. Insurgents, many of them Ukrainian nationalists, were using shipments of grain as cover for attacks on Bolshevik forces. Stalin's anger was boiling over, and he was determined to crush the Ukrainian resistance once and for all. By June of 1934, the Soviet Union was on the precipice of a great and bloody transformation. Stalin was laying the groundwork for his infamous Great Purge, a ruthless campaign to eliminate anyone who dared oppose his rule. But, unbeknownst to the Soviet premier, forces beyond his control were conspiring to bring about an abrupt end to his reign. At this time, there was a certain man of note residing in the city of Vienna, by the name of Yevhen Konovalets. Konovalets was a name simultaneously feared by Soviet leaders and revered by many Ukrainian nationalists. Born in 1891 in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Konovalets was a fervent and extreme nationalist who fought for Ukrainian independence during the tumultuous years following the Russian Revolution. When the Ukrainian People's Republic considered him too extreme to continue to hold a position in their military, he took a different path, one that led him into the business of paramilitary operations. In 1920, Konovalets founded the Ukrainian Military Organization, or UVO, a group dedicated to resisting Polish and Soviet control over Ukrainian ethnic territories. The UVO assassinated various Polish and Soviet politicians, including a Soviet diplomat on a mission to Lviv, and also went about killing Ukrainian politicians who were too eager to cooperate with the Poles for their taste. By 1929, Konovalets had extended his influence by forming the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, headquartered in Vienna, from which he acquired contacts in the American, German, Italian, and Lithuanian intelligence agencies. All of this was done to further his goal of protecting the Ukrainian state against all outside hostility. And, needless to say, Yevhen Konovalets was a man without boundaries, one who would take extreme measures to achieve this goal. In late June of 1934, Joseph Stalin would make a fateful decision. In a seemingly normal political visit, he traveled to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to inspect factories and party apparatuses, but more so to ensure that Sergei Kirov, head of the Leningrad Communist Party, was fully aligned with his agenda. Stalin needed to get rid of any threats to his power, and thus far, Kirov, a more moderate socialist, was on his list of risks. Leningrad, a city fraught with political turbulence and named after the first Soviet premier, was obviously quite critical to Stalin's plans for consolidating power. But as Stalin moved through the city's quickly developing southwest, inspecting factories and meeting with local officials, he was unaware that his visit was about to be cut short. Konovalets had arrived in Leningrad's port with a small group of Ukrainian and Lithuanian co-conspirators. They had bribed their way into the city's port, determined to strike a blow that would reverberate across the Soviet Union and beyond. Stalin's movements were closely guarded by his loyal bodyguard, Nikolai Vlasik, and several other security personnel. But the conspirators had their plan meticulously laid out. As Stalin inspected a newly constructed metalworking factory, Konovalets and his men seized their moment. They fired their weapons, and Stalin's men fired back, killing Konovalets and his accomplices. But it was too late. Stalin fell to the ground, clutching his neck. That night, at the hospital in Leningrad, he was pronounced dead. The Soviet Union was plunged into yet another period of political chaos. Only 10 years after the death of its first leader, Vladimir Lenin, the USSR had now lost its second. With Stalin dead, it'd be Sergei Kirov who would rise to power as the third premier of the Soviet Union. Ironically, the very man Stalin had traveled to Leningrad to secure as an ally would now inherit the leadership of this fractured and unstable state, while Stalin's old enemies, even Trotsky, lay in the shadows, preparing to return and take power should the opportunity present itself. Picking up the pieces of the USSR, Kirov would try to focus on stabilizing the Soviet Union. While Kirov was a ruthless figure during his time in the Caucasus amidst the Russian Revolution, he was not necessarily a tyrant. His premiership would take a turn towards economic reforms and a degree of liberalization within the party to gain broader support. Much of his policy agenda would backfire, and the more radical members of the Communist Party would immediately see Kirov as a traitor to the revolution, while the peasantry, not seeing any instant positive gains, would be indifferent to the new leader. All of this would lead to a political gridlock, a Soviet Union stuck in place, unable to balance the many factions within their government without a unifying figure like Lenin or an authoritarian one like Stalin. As all of this was occurring, Germany was busy redrawing the map of Europe. In 1933, only a year before Stalin's assassination, Chancellor Adolf Hitler had come to power. During his rule, he annexed Austria in the Anschluss, as well as the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German-speaking population. The dismemberment of Czechoslovakia was swift and brutal, and the nationalist wing of the Ukrainian state, concentrated in the Ukrainian People's Republic and the West, saw an opportunity. As German forces occupied the Czech lands, Ukraine signed an agreement with the breakaway state of Carpatho-Ukraine, integrating it into the Union and protecting it from Hungarian annexation. This move, however, was but a tiny step compared to what was about to come. Hitler's next target was Poland, and to ensure there would be no contest to his invasion of the Polish state, Hitler needed reassurances from the Soviets. The Soviets and Germans, like in our timeline, would sign a non-aggression pact, but Hitler also took interest in the state to the south of Poland, the Union of Communes and Hetmanates of Ukraine. Germany began to diplomatically maneuver towards an alliance with Ukraine, focusing on courting the leadership of the Nationalists and ensuring the cooperation, or at least indifference, of the Makhnovshchina and Cossacks. Within the Makhnovist movement, there was a division. Some anarchists were distrustful of fascist and fascist-aligned governments, given the recent conflict in Spain, wherein the Catalonian anarchists, some of whom were aided by Ukrainian ideologues, were crushed by Franco's forces. Others saw an alliance with the Germans as a way to ensure the protection and independence of their anarchist experiment, and others yet believed that the fascist movement was merely a prelude to a wider anarchist revolution, one that would spread across the world using the chaos of war as a catalyst. Nonetheless, the central government in Ukraine would move forward towards this closer relationship to Germany. Kirov, seeing this, began to mobilize Soviet forces along the western border with Ukraine, as the USSR and German Third Reich jointly invaded Poland, triggering the start of the Second World War. But to many in the Soviet Union, the agreements made with the Germans were fragile at best. The Nazi-Soviet pact was seen as little more than a temporary measure, a flimsy piece of paper holding back the inevitable clash of titans. As Germany continued its blitzkrieg across Europe, conquering Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, the Axis powers solidified their grip on the continent. Italy moved down the Dalmatian coast, and Hungary invaded Transylvania, while Germany installed a puppet regime in what remained of Romania, and, in an interesting move, invited Ukraine to invade Bessarabia. Kirov, now feeling increasingly isolated, attempted to force the Baltic states under the umbrella of Soviet influence, but his efforts were rebuffed. The Baltic nations, no longer seeing the Soviet Union as the overwhelming hegemon of Eastern Europe, resisted Soviet pressure and sought to maintain their own neutrality. This diplomatic failure was the last straw for Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky of the Red Army, who, fearing a joint German-Ukrainian invasion of the Soviet Union, attempted a coup against Kirov's government. The coup failed at unseating Kirov, but succeeded in plunging the Soviet Union into further disarray. In the summer of 1941, the planned German invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, finally began. But this time, the strategy was a bit different. German forces moved through Ukrainian territory, bypassing Soviet defenses that had been built with a different war plan in mind. Ukrainian forces provided logistical support and intelligence, but did not join in on the fighting. That is, with the exception of some Cossack militias who, driven by their historical enmity with the Bolsheviks, joined the invading force. The Soviet Union now faced a war that was tearing at the very fabric of its state. As German panzers rolled through the Ukrainian plains, and as Soviet resistance faltered in the south, the future of Eastern Europe was as unclear as the smoke-stricken battlefields that now scarred it. But what do you think would have happened? If you enjoyed this video, or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about Anarchist Ukraine. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.